The harder the conflict, the greater the triumph.
A fiercest serpent may be overcome by a swarm of ants.
Lead me, follow me, or get out of my way. Age wrinkles the body, quitting wrinkles the soul.
Battle buddies.
Battle buddies.
Check. The teeth and the tongue, the something in the lips, the teeth, the mouth and the lips, the teeth and the tongue, the mouth and the lips. Whoa. Have you flipped through that Vietnam War book yet?
Just a tiny bit, but it was at the library, and my son wanted me to read him the Penguin story.
It's probably a better choice.
Yeah, it wasn't as dark. I was like flipping through it, and like there's just like massacred farms of people.
Yeah.
My 2-year-old son's like, "What are you reading?" Maybe not this right now.
Yeah.
So I got some serious like dad points today. All right, like I leveled up a little bit. My wife found a leak in our sprinkler system. So I was able to turn off the water to it and then clean it and fix the diaphragm.
Is that the actual word?
That's the word. Made sure.
You Googled it.
I watched a bunch of old guys on YouTube do it.
Similar thing.
And they all complained because they tried to do it with one hand while filming with one hand. And as their listeners know, that's really challenging. So and then I fixed that fucking leak.
Bravo, Kevin.
I feel really good about it.
Are you kind of like me where you would not look at yourself in the mirror at night and be like, you know what? Pretty much anything in this house I can take care of.
I remember I might have just started grad school, and I was like really feeling I've not learned a lot about my hands yet, just about how to like think about things. And I went to my uncle, who's a carpenter, a really successful carpenter, and I was like, how do I become handy if that's not my job? And he said, you will become handy when you buy your first house.
That's fair.
And that's been really true. I've learned how to do a lot of things now.
Yeah, you do got to kind of figure some shit out.
Because you're too poor to call somebody to fix it.
You also don't have a landlord. It's like, the sink is broken. Yeah. Come over here and fix it. Now it's like, oh, shit, Drano doesn't work, really, does it?
Nope.
And so you got to figure out how to take the P-trap out. I remember when I just decided to fucking figure out how to unclog an actual drain in my sink. My wife was like, yeah, that did things for her. But she grew up with a handy dad. Yeah. So she's like, this is what men are supposed to be like, right? I'm like, God damn it. My dad didn't teach me shit.
Gotta figure this one out. Yeah. My dad tried to teach me. I had to call him today.
Oh, good.
Sure. Make sure. I was like, do I die if I get electrocuted off of this?
No. So they call it getting bit, I believe.
Yeah, he said just 12 volt.
Yeah.
Yep. Learned a lot.
Welcome to, should I say, Good Morning Battle Buddies.
Yeah.
We are here live from our beautiful studio where the weather sort of mimics Vietnam, actually.
It's very similar to Vietnam.
Yeah. Not as beautiful as Vietnam.
No.
Which I've heard that Vietnam is damn near looks like heaven on earth from what I've heard.
I want to go to the Central Highlands.
I do too, really bad. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Battle Buddies. We are here. We have reached all the way back to deep diving into a battle. We got a normal episode.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while, much like Stained said. It has been a while. And it feels good to be back. Getting deep and dirty we're heading to Vietnam.
Did you listen to that album that's back when you had the CDs with like the shock absorber?
Oh, yeah.
And just burned your battery real quick? Yeah, it's nice.
Freshman year of high school, this is going to date me here. I walked around with a CD player in my pocket with long emo-ass hair and always listened to the most recent album I bought at Best Buy. Yeah.
That's great.
Brand new. I was a brand new kid.
Brand new.
Do you listen to Brand New?
Brand new for sure.
Deja Intendu. Shout out to the album Deja Intendu.
Yeah.
Sad stuff. But anyway, Vietnam.
Also sad.
Very sad. Very, very sad.
We haven't talked about this. What are we calling it? Have you tried to say this word?
Yeah, Drang.
Drang?
Yeah. So
that first word is yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things that has helped me out a lot, I guess we should preface by saying there's a lot of words here that Kevin and I are going to get wrong. I'm going to do my best to Google things as we go along and make sure that we're getting it phonetically correct. My mother, who is a avid listener of our show.
Shout out to Spencer's mom.
Yep, the only listener. She's like, yeah, you guys should kind of work on your pronunciations. But my mom is a stickler for grammar and stuff like this. Yeah. So we're trying, Mom. Okay? God forbid I post something on Facebook and misspell a word. Oh, that is how you spell Wednesday.
Grammar is not set in stone.
Did you know that the person who used to correct Hitler's speeches was a grammar Nazi? Yeah.
Low-hanging fruit, guys.
Yeah, we're getting to start off with some good Nazi jokes.
Yep.
It's only going to be downhill from here.
Is that a good Nazi? Are there good Nazi jokes? I guess there are, huh? What's a bad Nazi joke?
It's a wholesome Nazi joke.
A wholesome Nazi joke. There you go. I like it. I can take a wholesome Nazi joke.
Yep. So what battle are we getting into today?
We're getting into Drang, the Drang Valley.
Drang.
Yeah. Okay. So there have always been and will always be events that shape a generation. For me, it was 9/11. I remember the day completely, and I still think about how different things have become since then. It is easy to understand how this changed my life because I have the information before and after to compare. The challenge is understanding how our lives have been influenced by events that happened before we were born. 25 years before I was born, there was a calamity for many Americans and Vietnamese. This was the Vietnam War. I have family members that died before I could ever meet them. Many of my uncles still will not talk about what they went through. How can we measure such an event so near to our lives yet impossibly far away? And how has it influenced our world? Can learning about what the world went through give us such a measurement?
I didn't know that you had family members that did not make it back.
I didn't either until I was older. There's a big like riff in our family like that happened from it because I think it involved like the spouse and the mother were like in a fight about who was feeling more like heartbroken over the loss. Like there was just like a bunch of like I can't even hear it. So I feel bad because if my mom's listening, she probably is mad that I don't remember the whole story. But it's so hard to listen to that kind of stuff because you're like, that's not something really far away and removed. That's something that's like in my immediate family right before I was born. Like, holy shit.
We spoke about it in our last podcast where we did a book review of war, where it seems kind of like this war was like a drunk uncle.
Yeah.
Where the American population didn't really speak about it. Last night, I was with my stepdad and my mom. So my mom graduated high school in 1969. And she's older than my stepdad. He's about to be 70. And so I asked him pretty much straight up, why were you not drafted?
Right.
And I've asked my wife's dad as well because he was in that generation. And it was a lottery system.
Yes.
So just lucky that they both did not go. And the way that Steve, my stepdad, was talking about it, he, not even having gone, was just sort of immediately, wow, what a horrible time.
Yeah.
What a horrific time in the United States where, and I heard this also in the Vietnam War series by Ken Burns, that it was akin to the polarization of the Civil War. Like we have not seen a polarization since the Civil War, much like that, which is interesting because I think that you and I could argue that right now it seems as though we also have a polarization in this country.
Right.
Pretty us versus them kind of mentality.
It's very significant.
Yeah. They also mentioned Kent State or Kent University massacre. Have you heard of this?
Mm-mm.
The National Guard during that time killed 9 students at a university for protesting.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
They called it the Kent State Massacre. Google it for those of you who are millennials and weren't around for this time period. But it's important to know that Kevin and I, though we were not alive during this time, as Kevin was just explaining, he has family members who he wasn't able to meet because they didn't come back from this war.
Right.
Completely understand that this is a sensitive subject.
Yeah.
My heart still drops when I am walking around places like San Francisco and I see Vietnam War vets on the street. I personally think that shit should be like illegal.
Yeah.
That our country should not allow that.
Right.
I wrote a letter to the editor that you've read.
Yeah, it was lovely.
After the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and I sort of made some parallels, but it's kind of hard to make that parallel because when I came back from Afghanistan off of the tarmac, I had people clapping for me, whereas people from Vietnam were getting spit on.
Right.
So sensitive stuff for this country. Yep. For those of you out there, I mean, I told Kevin that I was going to do this, but if you or anybody has some family members or friends that were Vietnam veterans that like need help or need assistance in any way, shape, or form, you can email us at battlebuddiespod@gmail.com. I'm a service-connected veteran, so I know the entire process of calling your nearest veteran service officer, and you can get an appointment with them, and they can start getting you sorted out. I know that veterans are still to this day from Vietnam going in and getting checked out so they can get compensation for some things that they went through. I too had an uncle, was a Marine in Vietnam.
Yeah.
He got cancer from Agent Orange.
Yep.
So survived the cancer, but still deep wounds.
Yep.
This one.
Absolutely.
Deep wounds.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, let's keep going into. So before we begin the Battle of the Drang Valley, we need to identify two problems that Spencer and I keep running into. And this isn't just for Vietnam, this is just in general. We keep running into these certain types of problems, but they really, I think, have come to like the forefront. Like we keep having to talk about it when we're planning the stuff out. So we're gonna check this out first. So first, the battle was very recent. For better or worse, it is more socially acceptable to find entertainment in events that happened further in the past. For an example, Dan Carlin had like this moment when he was talking about, I think it was Gaul. He was talking about something with the Gauls, and he was talking about a genocide, and he was making a joke, and he's like, and one day we'll make jokes about the Holocaust. And I was like, holy shit, did he say that? But he was explaining, he's like, it's because it's so near and people are still connected to it, it's still hard for people.
Yeah.
But 1,000 years from now, it will be just something you study, like we're studying the Gaul. And it was really sobering to hear a historian kind of say that so bluntly, and someone that I respect so much, because at first your knee-jerk reaction is like, well, you can't say that. But then I was like, wait, I got to listen to what he's saying. And it made total sense. Like, yeah, that's a harsh truth about humankind, or just how existence works. Time goes on.
Right. Time makes fools of us all.
Yeah, time. There was like some quote that I was really focused on at a certain point last year, which is like your hardest day or your best day, like time's going to make it go away eventually.
Yeah.
And that's just a fact.
Yeah. It's the only thing that continues in life.
Yeah.
It's time.
So my issue with this, though, that we find is harder to accept entertainment more recent, is that that's not really true. It just depends on how you define entertainment. Our society absolutely finds entertainment value in recent loss of life and conflicts. For example, movies Black Hawk Down, Zero Dark 30, American Sniper, We Were Soldiers, which is based on the battle that we're going to cover today, are all movies, and there's a way bigger list that I found, but these are the ones I was familiar with, about relatively recent conflicts where people died, right? Because a movie is about entertainment, right? That's how they get you to buy the ticket. And so they're absolutely trying to entertain you. What does this mean for us? I'm not really sure, but I feel better about continuing after we at least put this out into the open, so it doesn't feel like we're hiding this thing that we keep coming face to face with. Second, there is a lot of hate around this war on all sides that we simply cannot hope to contextualize in a show where we focus on battles. For Battle Buddies, our current approach is a series of simple statements: hate the war, love the soldier, unless it's Halsey. We do not need historical figures to be heroes. If we need to judge them, we judge them in the context of their times. We will break all of these rules if and when it is funnier to do so. All right, all that is to say this. If you have issues with anything we cover or how we cover it, please just reach out to us. Our goal is to entertain and to learn.
To caveat the movies that you were mentioning about their source of entertainment in regard to other people's suffering.
Yeah.
Even kind of putting away just war movies, think about how recent, after the Boston bombing marathon, a movie came out after that. Right after like that Deepwater Horizon with Mark Wahlberg. So like the oil spill, that one came out super recent after that. And I was like, you guys are capitalizing on like tragedies?
Yep. Quickly.
Quickly, yes. There was that one about the California fires, Only the Brave. Yeah. And I definitely fall victim to it. I know that my brother, he works with a coworker who was also in the Navy, and she hated her time in the Navy, rightfully so. I completely get it. And Clayton and I were like, let's go see the new Top Gun. Yeah, dude stuff. And she was like, fuck that movie. Like, that's just, who wants to go watch that toxic bullshit, the, glorifying military shit. And I get it, dude.
Yeah.
I completely understand that side of things. Rare is it that people walk out of, let me think, The Patriot with Mel Gibson and be like, you know what? I've come out a softer man from this experience. So.
Wildly inaccurate movie.
Really?
Only the clothes, but I guess the clothes were exceedingly accurate.
Dude, I don't understand how Mel Gibson gets his foot in the door with these ideas in these movies. So in The Patriot, it shows him like constantly thinking about not the French and Indian War, but like one of the wars where the United States was at war with the Native Americans.
Yep.
He's just constantly thinking back to it.
Yeah.
And like lightweight kind of glorifying it. And in the movie, we were soldiers, which, whew, if you want to get into it, we can get into it. But he's like, there's one scene where right before he's about to get deployed, he's looking through this huge book and just staring at the United States troops slaughtering Native Americans like pre-Civil War. And it's like, that's what you're going with? Like, I'm just getting inspired.
Yeah.
Like
that doesn't sound like Hal at all.
Right. It sounds like Mel Gibson.
It sounds like Mel Gibson.
Yeah. There's a lot of injection of Mel Gibson and being deeply Catholic in that movie, where me and my brother were trying to watch it. And we're like, man, I'm almost kind of uncomfortable watching this. Anyway.
Yeah. So that's where we're at. So if you have a hard time with things Vietnam, we will not be offended if you have to turn this off.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to just play it super serious the whole way and just make it really dry, because that's not how we learn. We learn by being cracking jokes to each other and like ribbing each other. That's how we've always learned. That's why we're doing the podcast. So that is exactly what we're going to do. But if you think that we've been like inaccurate or insensitive to a fault, like absolutely message us for any of our content, because I'd rather have the conversation than not. All right. So let's get into it. So this series will be the Battle of the Drang Valley. So my main source is We Were Soldiers Once and Young by Hal Moore and Joseph L. Galloway. This book is top tier, and I strongly suggest it to anyone who is interested. And while this book is 100% an American account of the war by the American colonel in that battle, the authors did a great job at least showing the other side, because Hal interviews the leader of the regiment of the People's Army of Vietnam. This is going to be the bulk of the Vietnam sources, because this is an early battle in the war. And what we should just probably understand right away is that most of the American enlisted who survived would have had a chance to get back home. So we get to hear from a lot of them. Most of the People's Army who survived this fight still had to fight for the rest of the war, and they likely didn't survive that. because that would be 5 more years or 4 more years of just intense fighting. And that was really sobering for me to read. You don't read that till like the end of the book. But I was like, that should be in the beginning. Like, what a crazy statement to make. And it really hit me home. For those wondering about the interviews, so he interviewed most of the general and the higher-ups like in 1990-ish, I think. He went back to Vietnam and like they had this big council meeting and he's like talking with the general that was like against him in the battle and is like really interesting stuff.
Yeah, how crazy is that? I don't know of any other type of experience where generals got to go back to the enemy and be like, can we interview you and talk about this now that we're over it, kind of?
The only thing I could think of was like the Pacific War when we quote unquote interviewed the Japanese naval commanders that survived, but it was an interrogation. Like it wasn't
different.
It was not the same.
I think that perhaps answers our question. I think the fact that we lost probably really helps.
You know what? I think that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so other sources, The Vietnam War by Ward and Ken Burns. So I have the book. Spencer, you watched some of the documentary on that?
Yeah, it is a long documentary. So I've gotten about, as we record this, I've gotten about 4 episodes deep. It's 10 total, I believe.
Okay.
Came out, I want to say around 2017 timeframe, 2016 maybe. I also read Baptism, a Vietnam Memoir by Larry Gwynn, which is a deeply narrative about experience driven, talking really about what it just feels like to be in war. Really intense, really well written, very, very, very sad.
Yeah.
And very, very, I also recommend it to everyone.
Okay.
I can't even compare it to other like memoirs that I've read because it's very, very unique. For those of you, to be honest, if anyone here is listening who is considering like enlisting in the military, specifically ground side and wanting to see combat, I think that this is a must read.
It's like a required.
Yeah. This is going to give you a good glimpse of what the repercussions of war are going to do to your psyche.
So this is the book I should hand out to 8th graders that are interested in enlisting.
On it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the year they're kind of learning about the Holocaust, right?
Yep.
Yeah, this would
be it.
Yeah. I also listened to the accompaniment to the Vietnam War series by Ken Burns. So the book that you have, I just listened to the Audible version of that while I've been driving at work, and still continuing my learning as we go through this.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm definitely more of a contextual version of what we've been learning, and you're a little bit more of what's been the specifics of the battle that we're going to be doing.
Yes.
Okay.
So then give me your elevator pitch. Why did we go to the Vietnam War? Why did we start that war?
So there we were. I'm going to try to make this I'm going to try to give a little, like a a paragraph version of why I think I can say this. And can you give me like maybe yes, no, or thumbs up?
I'll rate it.
Okay. So post World War I.
Okay.
World War I, from what I've been learning in our podcasting and reading, post World War I fucked up a lot of shit when it came to rewriting boundary lines for different countries.
Shout out to the Kurds.
Shout out to the Kurds. This is including Vietnam, which I believe at the time was called Indochina.
Yep.
Okay. Now, the English were colonizing India and going around the world and colonizing a lot of different countries at the time.
Yeah.
And other countries in Europe, including France, were doing the same thing. Now, France wanted their hand in colonizing with Indochina, Vietnam. It's my understanding that over time, the United States was really quite neutral, and I'm paraphrasing and skipping a lot of chunks here.
Yeah, we're gonna go way gloss.
Okay, so just for those of you who are like, why the fuck were we in Vietnam? We were neutral about the French being there. Okay, now Vietnam had split into 2. There was North Vietnam and South Vietnam, much like North Korea and South Korea.
Yep.
And it wasn't until the Russians and Chinese started to support the North Vietnamese that we really got scared deeply. The United States was deeply afraid of the spread of communism. Once that happened, we decided to go into and try to help South Vietnam fight the North Vietnamese from communism.
Okay.
Would you say that that's a fair little summary?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Who knows? All I have is
Who knows?
I think that sounds good. I was in the book. I was really surprised. This is one of those things where like, and maybe you will agree with it or not agree with it, but I think like enlisted guys in general, like the ones that I've known that are older, like they are so much in the like you don't criticize America ever, right? Like so like my uncles are like that, and like I love my uncles, but like they definitely like they do not like to criticize America, especially our past. And it's always shocking when I start to read from the higher ups themselves and like how easily they criticize themselves.
Yeah.
So how more early in this book, which is essentially like if you want it, like if you were really cynical, this book might be propaganda to you, right? Like, woohoo, America! Like we made helicopters, and this book is just helicopter propaganda, but well written. And he puts in very early on that like, just a coincidence that's important is days before Kennedy fell to an assassin's bullet, Ngo Dinh Diem, the autocratic ruler of South Vietnam, was deposed and murdered in a coup d'etat that was at least sanctioned, if not sponsored, by Washington.
Oh.
And I was like, man, like, it's so common knowledge and okay to criticize our own past as a higher up that, like, is just sometimes forgotten, I think, from, like, everybody, like, everyday person can also do the same thing.
Well, do you think that perhaps formal higher education has something to do with that?
I wonder, or like access, because like maybe it was just a matter of access to the materials themselves. Like in 1970, maybe that wasn't like super available knowledge.
Because to some degree, obviously, these officers who go to Halmore went to West Point, right?
Absolutely.
And Harvard?
Probably.
Okay.
He's crazy. We'll get into
According
how crazy
to the movie, he went to Harvard.
I don't know if he went to Harvard. He graduated West Point in like the 40s.
Okay. Yeah. Like post...
it was like 46, so World War II was just
post
ended.
World War II.
So he did that, and then he went into like the Korean War for a year or two.
Yeah. Okay. So according to the movie, he went to like Harvard and majored in like international relations or something like that.
That sounds right.
Yes. And so one would think that if you are someone who's been through all of this formal education and you're learning objectively about different things, of course you're going to be able to insult some of our decisions.
Right.
Whereas, and we talked about this in our last podcast, the whole system of a down, why do we always send the poor?
Right.
These people are indoctrinated.
Right.
And then not given the like, okay, now that you're done being indoctrinated, we also need to talk about how you need to make logical decision making on the battlefield. They're taught just follow orders.
Right, just follow the orders. Yeah.
So these people, of course, are like, fucking rock, flag, and eagle.
Right, exactly.
You know?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Like to survive, they had to take on the mission, right? Like the belief a little bit.
Just follow your orders.
Follow
dude.
your orders. Okay. Yeah, I can buy that.
Okay.
Well, because that makes sense, right? Because I think I would do the same thing. Like if I was told like, hey, you probably aren't going to make it through there. The only way you will is if you just follow all the orders. Like, yeah, I'll just follow all the orders then. And then I'll just never talk about that again or question it because, holy shit, I can't believe I survived it. So, like, that makes total sense to me now.
Of course, you're going to have allegiance to the fucking
exactly.
national anthem and flag and everything like that. And, hey, you know what? Salute to all those folks who do. Whatever. Good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it was just interesting that how, even in the beginning, is already being like, yeah, we're partly responsible for this becoming such a shit show so early. We're going to be talking about a lot of different Army units. This is something that reading the book, the only challenging part as a civilian reading these battle stories is like, I have no freaking idea like what troop sizes are or like what the difference between everything. So I looked it up for everybody.
Oh, look at you.
And I'm sure I got it all wrong, but I'll happily take criticism from Spencer.
Never know.
Yeah. Okay, so this is just going to be a quick breakdown of general terms that we're going to see a lot, and that way we can refer back to them as we're needed. But what's helped me is just understanding that when we're talking about like unit sizes in Army, we're really talking about orders of magnitude. Like they don't always go up by an actual like decimal, but they may as well have, like in terms of their strength. So we'll start with the smallest unit. The smallest unit is a squad. A squad is 6 to 10 soldiers, and they're commanded by the sergeant. I'm correct in that a sergeant is usually an enlisted soldier?
Almost
100%.
100%.
Okay, 100%. Got it. Okay. Platoons are the next unit up, right? That's 3 to 4 squads, and that's commanded by a second lieutenant. A company, battery, or troop, we're going to be calling them companies in this one, I believe. That is 3 to 4 platoons, and that's commanded by a captain, first lieutenant, or major. A battalion is 3 to 5 companies, and that's commanded by a lieutenant colonel. A regiment is 3 to 5 battalions and is commanded by a brigadier general or a full colonel. And a division is 3 regiments and is commanded by a major general. And then a corps is 2 or more divisions, and that's commanded by a lieutenant general. But we won't probably be getting into that. How is that?
Lovely.
Okay, that's more or less how you understand it?
Well, sure.
Yeah, sure. It'll get us through it.
It also, I think it's fair to say, I think it varies. It varies from military to military.
Yeah, I could see that too.
Yeah.
Okay. To understand the absolute mess of a battle we are about to get into, and please, listeners who aren't familiar with this battle, it is an absolute mess. We need to understand the 7th Cavalry Division, or what we might call the Air Mobile. And this is why this battle is remembered, because of this Air Mobile thing. Like, they're crazy folk, and they're awesome. So the story goes that after World War II, America began preparing for another large conflict in Europe. Did you know that? I didn't know that.
Well, wasn't it in the thing that you sent me today?
Yes.
Okay, so I didn't
essay.
tell you I read that little paper that you sent me today, which was enlightening.
Yeah, how well written was that? Like,
we'll post it on our. I'll post it in the Book of Faces. So we got like 4 friends now, dude.
That's cool.
It's just my family.
So Kennedy then shifts to preparing for smaller conflicts and investing in new ideas. So basically, what happens is after World War II, the Pentagon and all the research and development, everyone thought we were going to be fighting in another huge, like, worldwide land war in Europe. And then they realized right before and during Korea, that we're not going to be fighting large-scale battles. Instead we're going to be fighting these smaller skirmishes. And so that we need a different approach, because like just a bunch of huge tanks isn't going to work anymore if we don't have the space, and that's not the way that this battle is going to be operating. Shout out to America's new 2 medium-sized wars at all times structure that we have today. So Major James M. Gavin, who was a lieutenant at the time, I think, wrote an article while working research and development for the Army called Cavalry, and I Don't Mean Horses, in 1954. It's an interesting read. He basically states that military minds incorrectly believed that tanks were the new cavalry, even though they did not have the speed to go against modern infantry, or motorized infantry, I think is what they also call it. This led to the formation of an experimental unit called the 11th Air Assault Division, or Air Mobility Division, commanded by Harry Kennard.
Yeah, so that's it. The paper that Kevin is talking about, called Cavalry, and I Don't Mean Horses. He's arguing that cavalry inherently means that you're mobile as hell. That's why horses were cavalry, which even in the Civil War, they would dismount, maybe hide their horses somewhere so that they could get to certain spots and flank different troops in the Axis. And you can't do that with a tank. You're pretty openly seen. So he's saying, like, these helicopters, which we will get into hardcore with this battle, being able to dive, duck, dip, dodge, and
oh my God, it is just dodgeball.
Makes it cavalry. That's the argument, essentially, in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Proceed.
The author of the book, Hal, and I'm only calling him Hal because he says Hal will do just fine early in the book.
His name's Harold.
Yeah.
Why Hal?
I don't know. He talks about, when he talks about himself in the book, he says, "I'm Harold Hal Moore, but Hal will do just fine."
Like, I'll call you Hair.
And I was like, because like I usually have kind of an issue with people calling like band members by their first names. Like, you don't know me without you. Like, you just don't talk about Aaron. Come on. All right. But he invites it, so I'll do it. So Hal reports that he was part of the division from the beginning. Let's get into a little bit about Hal being a crazy son of a bitch. So Hal was a crazy West Point grad and tested experimental parachutes as a 26-year-old lieutenant.
Fuck that.
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of.
Bro, wasn't he like dragged for miles? And what? Are you getting that?
We're going to tell the story.
Okay.
So he tells the story. On my first jump, a new steerable parachute I was testing hung up on the tail of a C-46 aircraft, and I was dragged, twisted and trailing behind the plane at 110 miles per hour, 1,500 feet above the drop zone. The tangled mess finally broke free a few minutes later, and my reserve chute got me to the ground safely. When I reported into Kennard, all he said was, "Hello, Lucky." He also did a 14-month combat tour in Korea, and then he took command of a battalion of the 11th Air Division in June of 1964. So, remember, a battalion is 3 to 5 companies between 100 to 1,000 soldiers. Hal's standards were: only first place trophies will be displayed, accepted, or presented in this battalion. Second place in our line of work is defeat of the unit on the battlefield and death for the individual in combat. No fat troops or officers. Decision-making will be decentralized. Push the power down. It pays off in wartime. Loyalty flows down as well. I check up on everything. I am available day or night to talk with any officer of this battalion. Finally, the sergeant major works only for me and takes orders only from me. He is my right-hand man. Hal's battalion had 3 rifle companies, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Each company had 3 rifle platoons and 1 platoon of 3 mortar squads. There was 1 support company, Delta Company.
I was reading, I think it was on the History Network website, that when he did that jump where he was testing the parachutes, and he was being dragged for how long? Miles?
He doesn't say. He was like, I was dragged for a while, and then I finally got my reserve chute going.
The after action report on that, he was like, no, I wasn't worried about it. I knew I was going to get away with it. It's like, fuck you. No, you didn't, dude.
You didn't. Hannah and I were talking, like, I can see being like 26 and like eager to prove yourself by like testing crazy stuff, like maybe even something as crazy as a bulletproof vest, because they tested it on dummies first. But there's no testing the parachute. That's steerable.
Fair.
The only way to actually test it is to throw a dude who's an idiot out of the plane with it.
Yeah, I guess the moral of the story, this dude had balls. Yeah.
And I don't think anybody would disagree with that, whether they like him or not. Okay, I have a couple questions, though. So, what is the difference between a sergeant major? Because he talks highly of his sergeant major, and we'll get into him in our next episode, but he's like a big deal, and he makes a point that like his lieutenants, especially his new lieutenants, like they can't even talk to that guy.
Right. So lieutenants are often called like butter bars.
Okay.
In the military. Are you asking me what's the difference between lieutenants and a sergeant major?
Or like what's the difference between a sergeant and a sergeant major? I understand that a lieutenant is a commissioned officer.
Yes. So a lieutenant is essentially the private of the officers.
Okay.
You don't have a lot of experience. Right. You're new. So you're not really respected because you don't got any ribbons showing that you've had experience and worked your way up the chain of command. So a lieutenant, a butter bar, would not have the same respect as a sergeant major because a sergeant major has been through some shit.
Yeah.
Sergeant major is a high-ranking enlisted person who's going to be in charge of a lot of shit.
Okay. I think this sergeant major, I'll go into it next episode, but either this sergeant major or another sergeant, some of these guys have parachuted into World War II and Korea, and they call them like old dirty bastards or something. Like, not old dirty bastard, because shout out to old dirty bastard, but essentially that's what they called them. It was just like the old fucks that you don't mess with. Like,
yeah, dude. So
crazy.
For instance, when I was overseas, I was sharing tents with sergeants.
Okay.
I was bunking with sergeants. Now, yeah, they're obviously in charge of me. That's an E5. But a sergeant major probably has their own little living situation going on.
Okay.
And if I pass a sergeant major, I better sure as shit be given like the greeting of the day,
Okay.
showing hella respect.
Okay.
Whereas like some of my sergeants, I'm like, "What's up, Frank?" You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So big difference. Sergeant major, you're retiring from the military.
Okay.
Sergeant, you might be getting out in a couple of years and going to school.
Okay. That makes sense to me.
Okay.
And then my other question for you is so this battalion is set up with 3 main companies and then 1 like support company.
Mm-hmm.
Is that pretty standard too? Like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and then you have your Delta that's going to just blow shit up all the time.
So perhaps in a combat company regiment for sure,
yeah.
because of the way I would view that as far as a support company is if one company gets completely obliterated, it's like cool, we'll send in Delta.
Yeah, but he's going to actually do something different. Bravo's going to be that.
Oh, interesting.
Because he needs Delta to be just laying in like because Delta is like the recon and they're the mortars, and even though each company has their own mortar squad, that's not enough. Like they need Delta to.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So they're providing support from afar as far as like bombing, bomb support and artillery. You said.
Yes.
Shit.
We'll get into. They get freaking wild.
Yeah, I mean, because here's the thing: it's like in Afghanistan, we're not using fucking artillery,
right?
Bro.
Okay.
We're using HIMARS, which are rockets.
Right. Well, and so that was another big thing is when he's talking about all this, like a lot of the mortar like ideas are they're old school ideas from Korean War and from World War II, where it's like anti-tank stuff.
Yeah.
And so they're slowly phasing all that out for just like big ass machine guns.
Right, because does Vietnam have tanks?
No,
there you go.
Because they're climbing down from the mountains.
There you go.
And they're fucking badasses. We'll get into that today. Okay, but let's keep going into what this idea is. Like, how is it going to work? So the idea was to use helicopters to turn those 4 companies into the knight on a chessboard. Again,
what does a knight do?
Yeah, so a knight is going to be able to do an L, right? So an L is it seems like it's stupid and it seems like it's not that powerful until you can't really figure out where the knight's going to be in 3 moves, right? That's what makes knights crazy is they can move backwards and then forwards in a new place, and they're really tricky. And I think a lot of it is like, I've been thinking about while I was reading this, a lot of like Alexander the Great, early Alexander the Great, when he was still like maybe even with his father, Philip II, and that they would use anvil and hammer tactics a lot. So like they would use their cavalry to literally just go around the whole battle and just try to find like the highest ranking guys and just like get them.
That's great.
And it works really well.
Yeah, that's smart as fuck.
Yeah, and Alexander the Great makes a name for himself doing that against Xerxes.
Because technically, isn't this this would be in like asymmetric warfare where you just technically just sit there and be like, all right, now this people shoot at each other. Now these, and he's like, fuck all that. Let's just go straight to the fucking source and kill him.
Yep.
Because if you don't have a general, you don't have it. You're cutting off the head of a snake.
Yep.
Okay.
And so it's reminiscent of that.
I like it.
And these were cutting edge tactics, and they trained relentlessly. Traditional top-down authority had to be replaced with push-down authority. You see, they learned that using helicopters to throw infantry into a flank position was not an exact science. There would be no way to guarantee all squads would have their sergeants or platoons would have their lieutenants. To most civilians, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but for those who have served as enlisted infantrymen, that was a terrifying situation to be in. To me, this is like the most egalitarian structure that I've ever heard of in a military, especially our military. Basically, what it was saying is, or at least what Howell was saying, is that because you're part of this special force, you've already proven that you're as competent as anybody else, and you salute the rank, not the person, kind of thing.
It's great.
And I really appreciate that. So essentially what this means is that if the lieutenant is killed or separated, right, he comes in on a different helicopter, he gets killed right off the bat, and so there's only your squad, and there's no lieutenant to speak of, which will happen a lot. The sergeant doesn't have to worry about protocols. He just can immediately take over that lieutenant spot and just become the lieutenant.
It's great.
The private, I think there's cases in the next episode where like privates or like really low ranking guys have to become the sergeants essentially because like everyone just died and they're like, yeah, this is me now. all right, it's me. And he grabs the radio and he starts talking. And I'm like, fuck yeah, like, you all trained it. You all know the strategies. That's what Hal wanted. So, like, that's what you're doing.
Yeah. So that would be in that position. We would call that a billet. So
Okay.
so for instance, I used to guard a gate called Friendship Gate in Afghanistan. There was nothing really friendly about it. But one time I was going through a bunch of stinkers of sergeants, and they were fucking shit up, letting people on the base that they shouldn't have been letting. And this first sergeant came and dug his heels into the sergeant. He was like, Lance Corporal Schultz is the sergeant now. So if you have any fucking questions, ask Lance Corporal fucking Schultz. And I was like, that's hilarious. I'm a Lance Corporal and I'm the sergeant of the guard. I do not deserve that at all. But much different situation here with, oh man, dude, your lieutenant dying or your sergeant dying. I imagine, oh man. Do we get like first-hand accounts of these privates who were in charge? Oh, I'm excited. Yeah. I mean, I'm intrigued.
So yeah, and it's because this isn't common, right? This is not like a common thing that your officers die, but the Vietnamese were that good. Like they could tell immediately who the officers were, and so that's who they shot first. And like they're fucking crazy good. They're such good snipers. So anyway, this is also going into Black Swan territory for you. Shout out to Anti-Fragile. And as it gives solutions to unknown problems, something we see as an issue in all the conflicts we have covered thus far, right? In every conflict we've covered, there's been just crazy things that you could never expect. And I think they are hedging for unexpected things to happen. And I think that that's really clever. And it's why like Hal is remembered by all of his company as just like, or all his battalion by as just like this great guy, because he literally tried to prepare them for what if Hal gets shot right away? Like he's not God. And so who else can do it? And
so would you would say that a black swan is like an unknown variable?
Yeah, the black swan is it's an unexpected thing.
Okay.
And
in anything.
And it's usually so Anti-Fragile, that guy was largely like a risk analyst. And so he's mainly talking about like, you know, companies and like how to plan for risks that you can't be
from like a business standpoint.
Yeah. But black swans can also be good events too. And so like that becomes a whole thing.
Sure.
So unfortunately for the 7th Battalion, though, and I wish we could get into it, but it takes forever and it won't actually help our story, they shipped out without their most experienced soldiers on August 16th for Vietnam.
Yeah, there was a whole thing I remember in the movie that being a thing.
Yeah, it really was fucking messed up. So we won't talk about all of it, but basically there's this huge issue that happened where they knew they were going into Vietnam. And usually the president like signs an order saying anybody who is like 60 days out or whatever, 90 days out of the military can't leave. And this happened to like a lot of people after 9/11, right? And a lot of people were pissed about it. But what Hal says in his book, which is like, it is terrible to do that though, because we've been training. And
for like 2 years, right?
Yeah.
They trained for 2 years for all
like
this?
A year and a half or something like that. Yeah, they train forever. And they like every day, like they're training and they're throwing people out of helicopters and like no one else can do it is the thing. Like this is an experimental force. There's like, 200 people or 1,000 people in the whole world that know how to do this. And he loses like half of them. And then so he gets a bunch of new lieutenants. His standing orders, lieutenants aren't allowed to talk to anybody. They're only allowed to ask questions to sergeants. Like,
I love it. Are you serious? Yeah. I love it.
It's so good.
Oh my God. We should get shirts that we could sell online that say, fuck the brass. Okay. Fuck the brass. Fuck the brass.
Oh, it's so good. And I don't know how I feel about that. Like, that order is like so...
Power move.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Hal's order is awesome, but I mean, in terms of the president not signing the order.
Oh, no, that's fucked up.
Yeah. But then I also understand if, like, I did my time and I really don't want to go to war and, like, I'm almost out, like, don't make me stay in and go to war.
Well, then you shouldn't have been training in the first place.
Yeah, that's where I keep going back to. But then I feel bad for people that got stuck in after 9/11. Like,
the stop loss thing?
Yeah, stop loss.
Yeah, so was the issue here that they would have had to re-enlist in order to go? And they were like, well, I'm not re-enlisting. And they're like, well, then you can't go.
It was that no one's allowed to go with a certain number of days left in their tour or their enlistment. It's interesting.
I would have been so relieved.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I want to judge on this, but this is honestly just something that...
This is a black swan, right?
Yeah, I'll never judge this because I could imagine being on every side and being pissed or relieved, depending on... It's just a thing. It's just a positional thing.
It just happened.
Yeah. So anyway, it's going to mean two things. It's going to mean that Howe's force his battalion is going to be a lot smaller than he wants it to be, and they're going to be a lot greener than they should be, which he's going to do his best to make up for. But, the thing that saves him, I think, is that he has good sergeants, and that his sergeant major is so good.
Sergeant's backbone.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into a little bit of the North Vietnamese. So in 1964, Ho Chi Minh settled a locked debate between the Young Turks and his general Vu Nguyen Giap. Sorry if I mispronounced. Zap?
Of all things. So, folks, it's spelled Giap.
Zap?
Because I've been watching the Vietnam War. It's Zap. I'm gonna, while you're reading, I'm going to confirm. But
yep, sure.
Yeah.
I found it interesting that I didn't know that the Turks were helping in this war council at this time either.
The Turkish?
I think that's
people?
what they're talking about. Young Turkish military advisors.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know I don't understand all of it. So the question was, should they continue the guerrilla warfare, which was very successful against the French and very successful so far against the South Vietnamese, or should they escalate with hammer blows? Ho Chi Minh agreed to escalation for 1965, so that would be what they did in the campaign of 1965. It would be a mistake to see this army as careless or ignorant to war. For one, the anvil and hammer tactic was made famous by Alexander the Great and his father Philip II, as I've already talked about. The hammer is like a real thing.
This is where you were telling that they go around and just go straight for the...
You just go freaking straight for the jugular. And you do most armies, traditional armies, like back in ancient times, it's they approach, they push, and then one retreats. Like that's like the general military tactic. And the anvil and hammer is like you go up and push, and then you also just like lay it on them. And so they were talking about it instead of just as like a simple battle, they were talking about just like as a huge war strategy, just lay it on thick. Like no more guerrilla warfare, sporadic fighting, just push them because they aren't as committed as we are, which was true.
Also not their homeland.
It was all those kinds of things.
Not acclimated.
Yeah. And they thought that the South Vietnamese would buckle because they weren't as committed to this cause as the North Vietnamese that were just like so fired up at this time.
And so Ho Chi Minh was in charge of the North, right?
Yeah. So he had this military council, as best I understand it. I'm sorry if I got this wrong. Email us. But basically, the way I understand it is he had this military council, and they were in like a legitimate deadlock in terms of how they wanted to pursue 1965. Half of them, including the young Turk advisors, they wanted to escalate, and some of his senior generals didn't. They're like, the guerrilla warfare is working. Like, why change what's working? We will beat them through attrition. And so he was the decider in that.
Got it.
Which, of all things, just sounds like they have a really responsible and thoughtful military advisor committee, right? Like they're...
Dude, so I listened to this Ho Chi Minh series on Spotify from the show called Dictators, and I could see why a lot of people followed Ho Chi Minh. Yeah. He was super sound. Like at one point he even says, "We just want what the United States has.
Oh,
we just want freedom for everybody." What did he say? He straight up quoted the Constitution.
Dude, and when we get into the 66th Regiment, I'm pretty sure Rocky IV is just based on this. Like, it's like, what? This is just Rocky IV? Like,
this is the kind of research we do for these podcasts, exactly. Folks.
Is Eye of the Tiger playing right now? All right. So Major General Wang Zhang, I did not get that name right. I apologize. He was a veteran of the Drang battle. He described their reason as, "We knew how to fight the French. We wanted to draw American units into contact for purposes of learning how to fight them. We wanted any American combat troops. We didn't care which ones." So there's like a famous line also that you'll get from the North Vietnamese at this time, which is like luring the tiger out of the mountains, which I think is from General An. Basically, they want to lure Americans out because they want a decisive battle so that they can learn how to do it. because they realize this war is not going to be over as quickly as everybody else thinks it's going to be over. Okay. In August, they began the 2-month march down the Ho Chi Minh Trail toward the Drang Valley. These soldiers from the People's Army were well trained. This is where it sounds like Rocky IV right here. So their basic training was 13 weeks, 6 days a week, 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. They focused on tactics, weapons. They had time set aside to discuss why they were even going to war. They were constantly reminded that their fathers had beaten the French colonists and that it was their turn to defeat American imperialism. This is immortalized in the Ho Chi Minh dictum. Nothing is more precious than freedom and independence.
Sounds like the United States
Sounds
to me.
like freaking the United States. I get chills and they were just impassioned people. So the recruits would then be split into NCO training or advanced infantry training.
NCO stands for non-commissioned officer.
Okay, so essentially they put everybody into basic, and then they like so you might be able to lead, so that you become an officer, and then
an NCO. Well, I only know this for American forces.
Sure.
It's once you get up to like E4 and above would be a non-commissioned officer. So your corporals, your sergeants, your staff sergeants, or that would be a staff NCO, but like a corporal and a sergeant are a non-commissioned officer. It's enlisted.
Okay.
It's not a commissioned officer.
Okay. And that's what I think that still translates, because that's how it was kind of described, was like they took half of them to train them how to become leaders.
Yeah.
And then, or not half, the ones that they thought would be good at it. And then everybody else went to advanced infantry training, which was crazy to read.
I bet.
They learned how to freaking do it. Like they learned how to be infantrymen. But then all of them in 1964, they moved to the mountains of Vietnam for physical conditioning, like rock climbing. So they're like scaling up these huge mountains with backpacks full of rocks. And then they'd have to like work on camouflage while they're up there from each other and like hide from each other.
What?
Is nuts.
Dude, that's so I hate to say that's cool as shit.
But it is though, like
yeah.
What we're gonna find, and like those are like, oh, we shouldn't glorify. Both sides are going to be so like impressed with each other during this fight.
Gallantry, bro.
Yeah, they are both so impressed with each other.
I want us to always comment on the gallantry of game respects game.
Yeah, if you're gonna play the deadliest game you can play, which I don't think anybody should have to play,
worthy adversaries.
Yeah, at least do it. So they were, in my mind at least, Renaissance men of high order, maybe the highest order, right? Like, I want these soldier poets. So Howe writes that the People's Army soldiers, young and old, were diarists, which I've never heard that word. So almost every man carried a small notebook, which he filled and copied love poems, the lyrics of popular songs, his own writing. He would have
the Vietnamese did this?
Almost all of them had diaries that they meticulously kept on these long treks that they would go on.
You mean to tell me that woke culture was like way before our generation?
Oh man, and they would write about like how much they miss their home and their loved ones, but that they just were so impassioned by
this goes into exactly what we were talking about in our last episode, where you see the enemy was talking about the exact same thing that we were talking about. You don't think for a second that someone in the army could have picked up these diaries and been like, "Oh, I feel the exact same way. I miss home as too."
Hal's going to pick one up at the very beginning of this battle and just start reading it, and it becomes like a huge thing that he references a bunch.
Did he learn how to speak some Vietnamese?
He learned a little bit. So on their travel over, a couple of the officers like brought cases full of books on like Vietnamese culture and battles and stuff, and like they made Hal made everybody read them all. Like all the officers had to just like sit through reading them, which sounds awesome. Like they did that kind of stuff.
So in the memoir that I read, he was an officer, and he said that when they first got to Vietnam, I believe Saipan, all it was in the beginning was going through Vietnamese culture, learning sayings. Like, so you actually, in the book, that when you read the memoir, you learn a lot of Vietnamese.
Wow.
I believe hello is Hao Chun.
Okay.
Hao Chun. And I'm probably wrong.
But it's okay. You're learning.
Yes, we're students, folks. We are students.
Yeah, it's, another thing that maybe would be important to talk about here is Hal talks about this group is going to be very different from who is later drafted in ending this war because of the way that the war goes. So these first people in 1965, he described them as their fathers fought in World War II and their older brothers fought in Korea.
Interesting.
And so they were doing what they thought was the same as their brothers and fathers, and that the America they left is not the America they came back to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is important for this, because this sounds like way more like, it sounds like it doesn't mesh with what we know about the Vietnam War, right? I always just like think of like movies and stuff where like everyone's like, why are we here, man? But this is the very beginnings of it. You know, this battle is going to set the tone for like, maybe this isn't what we thought it was. But they didn't know that yet. You know, they were told to go do this and that it was right. So they went and did it.
Right. And prior to us sending in things like, this is the 7th Cavalry, right?
Yep.
So prior to us sending in the 7th Cavalry, for those who are familiar, the armed forces in the United States Navy were doing, Operation Rolling Thunder.
Yes.
Which should have just been called Operation Let's Bomb the Shit Out of Vietnam. Yes. And they were quickly realizing that wasn't working.
No.
And so
we did it again later on in the Middle East. No. Something else.
But so is it Lyndon B. Johnson?
Yep.
He is sitting there and you hear these recordings. These are recordings of him talking, asking in desperation all these different figureheads like, what the fuck am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And everyone, first of all, if you're a president and you're walking around asking people what you're supposed to do, just so you know, don't be the president.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
And so he felt like he was pushed in a corner and was like, I guess I'm going to have to send troops, especially once Russia and China got involved in the north.
Yep.
So that's just some context.
Yeah. Okay. I know, and there's a bunch we can go over that. But
yeah, there's a lot going on, dude. And you know what? You and I are going to return to Vietnam at some point.
We will have to.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into the American strategy for this battle. So in the fall of 1965 in Vietnam, Hal got his orders from Colonel Brown that said, here is your area of operations north of the Chu Pong and the Drang Valley. Your mission is the same one you have now. Find and kill the enemy. Sounds an awful lot like the North Vietnamese mission as well in this time period.
Okay, so that's it. That's pretty simple, right?
They're both going to get exactly what they want in the worst way. Neither side is going to get, they're going to get exactly what they want.
Okay, so can you give me, before we go further, can you give me a bottom line up front for both sides? Like what exactly, if I'm a sergeant and I'm writing a letter back home to my wife, what am I telling her I'm doing? What is the point? Like, so my mission is to literally just find the enemy and kill them?
Yep, on both sides.
That's it. Simple as that.
It's just the Army really wants to try out this air mobility, and the North Vietnamese really want to figure out how to fight Americans so that they could keep what they believe is the correct form of government and way of life free.
This sounds like an expensive petri dish.
A little bit.
Of an experiment.
A little bit.
Okay.
So now that we have both sides of the conflict moving toward this valley, let's talk about the battlefield itself. The Gia Drang Valley is just east of Cambodia and southwest of Pleiku. Cambodia is important. It's about 10 miles away, I think, because at this time period and for a couple years later, America was not allowed to chase the North Vietnamese into Cambodia. So what they would do is they'd go to Cambodia, form up their regiments and the battalions and stuff, and then they would go in back into Vietnam and fight. And then when they needed to run, they'd run back into Cambodia. And Americans really did not appreciate that because it made their jobs harder. It is what is referred to as the Central Highlands. There is a Vietnamese military maxim that states, he who controls the Central Highlands controls South Vietnam. There's a lot of stuff that Hal also goes into about who used to live in the Central Highlands and who would fight for North and South. That is pretty interesting, but we won't go into now. The actual landing site that was chosen by the Americans, LZ X-Ray, was about a football field long. The Chu Pong Massif, which is a series of mountains, were to the south and the west. The fields had tall grass, large termite hills, and intermittent trees. Ja means river in some dialects, and the Drang River comes from two smaller streams on the north side of the massif. At this time of year, there would also be dry creek beds.
These large termite hills are going to come into a pretty huge
They're
play here.
Yeah, when I say large, I mean
they're like 6 feet.
Yeah,
right?
they're huge,
Yeah,
and
they're
they're
massive.
wide, and you can hide a squad behind them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, they become very. I tried to write down geographical things that come up specifically with the fighting. So the tall grass they called elephant grass. That becomes literally, it's going to be people hiding in this grass on both sides. The termite hills play a huge part, and the intermittent trees become important when they're establishing their firing lines and for snipers and trees.
Couple questions.
Yes.
Do we have any explanation as to the choice? First of all, LZ stands for landing zone.
Landing zone.
Why X-ray? Do we know?
Yes, we do know. I think it was Matt Dillon, and we'll talk about Matt Dillon soon. Let's see. So the letter X or X-ray in the NATO alphabet. Wait, let me go back one. Whoop. Okay, so this is from Hal. When it came time to give a code name for map and radio identification to that clearing we finally chose for our landing at the base of Chupong, Captain Dillon, my operations officer, did the honors. He normally picked short words, the names of animals or birds, one-digit numbers, the letters of the alphabet as expressed by the NATO phonetic system. That day he went with the letter X or X-ray in the NATO alphabet. The North Vietnamese in 1965 also used code letters to shield the identifications of their regiments. General An says the code letter for the 66th Regiment at the time was X.
Got it.
So this is a crazy coincidence because the 66th Regiment is the one they're going to fight.
Damn.
So
they didn't know that.
They didn't know that.
Holy shit.
It's crazy.
Okay. And then he who controls the Central Highlands controls South Vietnam. Do we know what why would they say that?
I think it's just because it goes into that huge massif, right? Because that shares the border with Cambodia, and then that controls like a lot of the reason why Hal starts looking at that area so early is because it's like that's where all the water's coming from. Like, if you are a traveling army, like that matters. Like, that's how you're getting your clean water. That's your supply line. They just felt it was really important, and so they must have caught on to something that Vietnamese people already understood as a fact.
And a massif is just a group of, it's kind of like an archipelago, but for mountains.
Whoa. Hey, that's cool.
Words, guys. We're learning. Okay.
So the mountains go like 1,000 feet to 2,000 feet tall, I think.
And it's just, is it by sheer coincidence of geography that there's these clearings are crazy? For those of you who haven't seen them, I would recommend Googling images of these LZ, these landing zones that they chose. Coincidence that they're just clear brushes that they could land?
I think they're coincidence because I think it has to do with what normally is the rivers running through it, because they're right next to a dry creek bed. I know that, and that becomes a huge deal for one of the companies.
Okay.
I think I don't really know. If you're a geologist, maybe shoot us a little email on this.
Well, it's really the only reason I ask is because when you watch videos of this or see pictures of it, very choice landing zone, super clear grass, but it is surrounded by really intense jungle and mountains.
Yes.
So
they had a few different ones that they could choose from. I think they said they thought they saw communication wire in LZ X-ray near that area, so that's why they chose that one. And it was like the biggest one. We'll talk about the loading times, but that becomes really important for the whole air mobility unit.
Yeah, and so the football field long, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they choose to land like 8 at a time.
Yeah, we'll talk about that now.
Okay,
but I think that's right. So the operational strategy of the 7th Cavalry is fascinating to examine. Hal was to be on the ground. His operations officer was Matt Dillon. Dillon would spend most of his time in a helicopter above the battle. His job was to reconcile the strategy and tactics versus the reality that Hal was reporting. In my view, he was the most important person in this cavalry.
Hell yeah.
Hal would probably say it was a tie between the operations officer and his major sergeant, or sergeant major, sorry. Now, that has to do with like a clout switch thing that I was reading about, which is that, the theory in your strategy is not what's going to happen because the battlefield is not a chessboard. When Spencer and I played chess, every piece moves exactly how I want them to move, but in war, there's a million variables. Plus, there's all the egos and there's all the humanity. And so people get scared and people do the wrong thing and people get excited and they don't always do exactly what they're supposed to do. And so this guy, Matt Dillon, is going to be like, I think it's such a clever idea. And it's something that I wish Halsey had, or, you know, any of the guys in the Pacific. Like,
I'm telling you right now that sounds like the coolest job, having a bird's eye view of all of this and being able to talk to your reconnaissance on the ground is a pretty awesome. Can't necessarily say advantage because we're going to see how this plays out. But
it is an advantage in that it helps them use the technology advantage that we have to devastating effect.
Okay.
Like,
That's
I think
huge.
without Matt Dillon and that type of idea, no way. Even with the technology, even with the artillery, and even with the M60s or M16s, whatever their weapons are that are so good, it doesn't matter when they know the force better than you.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of driving over the summer for my job. And I just recently listened to the whole 4 hours of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And then I listened to a great courses dissecting it.
How many times did you fall asleep and like hear the bumps on the road?
I actually really liked it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool.
It's really fun. It's very poetic, and it kind of sounds like some Buddhist stuff, even though it's definitely not. But a whole chapter is on terrain.
Yep.
And it's talking about how you need to have a relationship with the terrain.
Yeah.
And that the terrain needs to be, we say it, we have a colloquialism in the United States where we say, oh, I know that like the back of my hand. Right. Similar thing going on with the Art of War. And, you know, Sun Tzu also talks about when there is uncertainty with what you're about to do, then that means you that by definition within this doctrine, you don't do it.
Okay.
Now, that obviously is an extreme version, and this is written in ancient times.
Yep.
So I just say that to kind of give context here as to the Vietnamese. As you said, they've been training in these mountains.
They've been training in these mountains, and they're massive, and then they're going to come down it.
And so our relationship is from a bird's eye view in a helicopter and some guys who just landed.
Yep.
And we're probably staring at a map for a really long time.
Yep.
That's it.
And I did gloss over, there were some like battles before this, but they're kind of confusing, and basically the Vietnamese like lose some sporadic fighting that they tried to do against one of the forts.
Against the United States?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And the South Vietnamese. But it's kind of confusing, and it doesn't really like pertain to what we're going to be talking about. The only thing that might be important is that even though Hal already has a weaker battalion, right? The air mobility is already weakened because of the variables we stated earlier.
Yeah.
They also got really pissed because one of the higher ups made them essentially fortify their own fort instead of being stationed further away at like an actual base. So they have to dedicate men to guard the fort all the time, so they have less men available to do the strikes. And you could just feel his anger when he's typing this out, even 30 years later. Like,
interesting.
What the fuck were they thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So the helicopters would be provided by the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion. They were commanded by Major Bruce Crandall, who went by the call sign Ancient Serpent 6. He was a complete badass, but we will go over that later. Finally, Captain Mikey Parrish would be the helicopter liaison officer. His job would be to be with either Hal or Dillon to coordinate the helicopters. So that's kind of how the operational structure works at its most basic. There's a lot more going on, but I think that's what's really important here is that you have Hal and Dillon talking, and then you have Bruce Crandall and this liaison officer coordinating how to get the helicopters in and out the whole time.
Can you remind me how many men they got kind of allocated? This is a company or a platoon of men?
It's a battalion, but they're so battalion can be anywhere from 100 to 1,000. It's supposed to be a lot more. I think it's supposed to be around like 700-ish, but I think they have 450 right now for today's fight.
Supporting this entire
this
operation.
Whole thing.
Okay.
But there's other ones that will get activated and stuff.
Okay. Just trying to get a visual here.
Yes. About 450. Okay. Here is a quote from one of Old Snake Shit 6. That's what they called ancient. So Bruce is great, and he's quoted as being like the funniest man alive, who also had like unwavering support from his other fellow pilots. So like this dude was like awesome. And anyway, so sometimes they would call him Old Snake Shit 6, which is great. But this is from one of his other pilots about how they used to train to fly these helicopters. So we trained from July 1964 until our arrival in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry in precision flying. So they would fly 4 aircraft in a V formation at 80 to 120 knots, barely above treetop level, following the contour lines of the ground. They would use radio work, navigation, foul weather flying, timing, always timing. Crossing the release point at a critical second. Coordinating with gunships, artillery, infantry, practice, on the ground with the troops, high overhead, reconnaissance, reporting. This all paid off. Many of us are alive today because we learned our lessons well. One issue about going from their base at Playmay to LZ X-Ray was that they would only have 16 Hueys, those are the helicopters, to shuttle the men on the 15-mile one-way trip. That presents 2 immediate problems. First, the first load of soldiers would be small and vulnerable. Second, it would take 4 hours to get all the men to LZ X-Ray.
Too long.
Hal would be on the first drop-off, flown by Bruce Crandall. Hal stated his reason as, in the American Civil War, it was a matter of principle that a good officer rode his horse as little as possible. There were sound reasons for this. If you are riding and your soldiers are marching, how can you judge how tired they are, how thirsty, how heavy their packs weigh on their shoulders? The current military theory of the time was to secure a 360-degree perimeter. Hal wanted to try something new with Bravo Company, being a reserve and strike force, so he was going to leave his South vulnerable. Yeah, a lot to unpack on that.
There is. I know that so I went and saw We Were Soldiers with my dad. And this is just to give people an idea here. This movie came out in 2002. I was 12, and my dad took me to go see this rated R movie, which was a common thing in my household. And one of the most indelible things for me that I always remembered from this movie was Hal Moore saying, "I will be the first one onto the battlefield, and I will be the last one off."
Yep.
And just internalizing that as a 12-year-old, I was like, oh, that's fucking terrifying.
Yeah, right.
And like super brave.
Yep.
And admirable. And so, I don't know, that's always been sealed into my soul that this is an officer who typically gets treated like royalty in comparison to these enlisted men.
Yep.
And he's saying, I will be there with you the whole time. Not only will I be there, I will be the first one in the line of fire and the last one to leave.
Well, and the thing that's even crazier when you really start picking it apart, especially as we go forward, is not only him, but Bruce Crandall is the leader of the 229th. And he's the one flying Hal in there. So, like, not only is your infantry officer the first one on there, but for the pilots, they all see it as well. Gold standard both ways. Like, so those two had like a mutual respect for each other. That is like, that's the gold standard for how special forces and military should work, right? Like, I think everybody, I was thinking about this today, anybody who joins the military probably thinks they deserve to be in that kind of group. Even though, like, does anybody actually have the balls to do that kind of thing? Like,
dude, my buddy Alan and I just recently watched Generation Kill, and I've read the book, and I've read its accompanying book called The Making of a Marine Officer. And the lieutenant in this story is actually wonderful and a really good leader. The captain, which is like an 03 in the Marine Corps, is a huge dumbass. And he at one point goes around and asks all of his Marines, like, oh, how do you feel about what's going on? And of course, there's like, it's great, dude. You're doing great. Keep it up, bro. And then he gets to the Navy corpsman, who's a medic for the Marines, and he's like, anything you want to share? And he's like, you don't want me to share. And he's like, no, I really want you to share. And he's like, well, you're incompetent as fuck, dude, and you're going to get us fucking killed.
Yep.
That's how I fucking feel. And this is a true story. And so I fear both from experience and from a lot of literature that I've read, this Hal Moore persona is an anomaly.
Yep.
So that's what makes this story even more interesting.
Yep. I think so too.
I think that as you and I dive into way more in the future, we're going to find a lot. Halsey is going to be a huge one that we're going to keep coming back to. It's like, turns out in the military, there's a lot of idiots who should not be leading.
Yeah. Who just follow their gut and don't. I don't get Halsey. I don't get you, Halsey.
He would have made a better singer. Hey,
he would have made a better singer.
All right.
But I love this idea because he wrote it in the book like it was almost, I almost went past it without thinking because he was talking about the current military standards were about, creating a 360 perimeter, and he was going to try something different. And I was like, wait, you're in an experimental group. You've never done this. There's no like standard. They were wanting you to try this as the standard, and you're like, I have my own ideas too.
We have different plans.
Yeah, like, oh man, you're crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
That does sound like someone who would jump out of an airplane with an experimental parachute.
Yeah, exactly. Good point.
Okay, so we will only briefly discuss the Vietnamese plans for this battle because they are the ones who were technically ambushed. And it's like not super clear to me. I reread all of it again today, and it's not super clear to me how much I believe they knew they were going to get ambushed or not. So I'm not going to focus on trying to answer that question.
I'm assuming in hindsight, a lot of people said that they did know.
Yeah, and they were looking for a fight, so it's like really muddy, in terms of like where they were, what they were doing.
The goal is to find the enemy, and when you find it, you can't be like, "What? This is bullshit."
Exactly.
No mayo.
So yeah, no mayo. So one of the leaders that Hal interviewed was Lieutenant General Nguyen Hu An. I'll say An.
Yeah.
When asked about his past, he talked about his father and said he was involved in the anti-French movement since 1937 and was put into prison by French in 1939. So I got this infection from my father, and it was a passion for me from a young age. That doesn't really have anything to do with what we're about to talk about, but I just thought it was important since we're going over Hal and how crazy he is. These generals are also like really respected, like multi-generational leaders. Like these soldiers he would probably tell this to his regiments, like, I've been here since my father was here fighting the French off, and like I'm still here to fight the Americans off.
So this exact guy is interviewed in the Vietnam War, Ken Burns.
Okay.
So and he uses a similar sentiment where he says, "I adopted my parents' beliefs."
Yes.
That's a cool little thing because we all too, when you're young, you see what your parents are into, and you're like, "Oh, I'm a Republican." It's like,
right.
Oh, why? Because my dad is.
Yep.
You're like, oh, okay, cool. Good for you, buddy. So we all adopt what we're born into, the household that we're born into.
So their 33rd Regiment was in the bad way after some rough fights pre-November. That's what I was talking about, with that there was some conflict and that they did get hit more. So that was their 33rd Regiment, and they are pretty depleted at this time. Like they're pretty dispersed in these mountains.
The Vietnamese.
That's
interesting. Oh, so that's why they thought that they could probably do pretty well because they had been already dwindled down by a previous battle.
That was part of it, yeah.
Okay.
They wanted to wait for the 66th Regiment to come down from the mountains to get a decisive fight with the Americans, learn how to fight. These are the people that are up there, performing Rocky IV. So their 320th Regiment was 10 miles northwest in Cambodia, but their 60th Regiment was in the Drang Valley at this time period. So General An says, when you landed here, you landed right in the middle of 3 of our battalions of the 66th Regiment, our reserve force. Thus, the stage is set for 450 air cavalry to go against 1,600 People's Army, neither side knowing what is about to happen. It's cruel. Oh, I just get chills. Like they literally drop into the middle of 1,600 North Vietnamese who have done nothing but write poetry and train,
live in the mountains
to get this fight for Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh,
and everybody else is doing it for Hal.
Right. Yeah.
Which is also that would also be very like if I was even a private that was a draftee, I'd be like, well, I'm glad I have fucking Hall as
Oh,
my
100%,
like,
dude.
I will fight real hard for you.
It's definitely the type of person you would want to be under in
Yeah.
a situation like this. The book Baptism that I read uses the analogy that landing here was like stepping on a hornet's nest with your bare feet.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. Super intense. It's hard for me to say I'm excited to see where this goes, but I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. And
I mean, it already happened. It's okay to be excited about it.
okay.
It'd be different saying, like, I can't wait till next year when we go and bomb what's left of the Kurds. Like, well, it's not great.
Even for ISIS, a little rough. All right. Well, that is part 1 of the LZ X-ray in Albany.
Yep.
We have, okay. Well, this has been wonderful. I'm excited to see where this goes. I think next week we will be also hitting up a At Ease episode, Current Conflicts, and then we will be returning to Vietnam. Anything else to cover on today?
No. Maybe. Probably.
Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you for listening. Bonsai.
Bonsai!